Hello again. Before I start talking about analysis at the agency, I'm going to share some relevant points from my background to help you judge whether or not I'm a credible source and to provide some context to the experiences over the 22 years that I had at the agency. During that time, I found that there were two types of people who ended up at the agency. One type who knew for years, sometimes since childhood, that they wanted to work there, and others who just kind of stumbled into it by chance. I definitely fell into the former camp. I was one of those kids whose room was filled with posters of attack helicopters and fighter jets, and I built models of ships and tanks. I was a total nerd when it came to anything related to military technology or history, and I also really enjoyed watching the national news every night with my parents. In high school, my favorite classes always dealt with current events, particularly anything that had to do with international news. Fast forward to college, where I realized that being a government major with an international relations focus was a perfect fit. Whenever I had to write a paper, I was able to find some sort of national security or military angle to explore. I was also lucky to have an internship at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where I immersed myself in security issues in an international environment. I also wrote a senior honors thesis that focused on military technology innovation. As graduation approached, I was self-aware enough to know that a career in the military was just not for me, in part because of some underlying issues I have with authority, but also being a military analyst who researched foreign militaries just sounded like a dream job, and the ideal place to do that, the only place I could think of to do it actually, was the CIA. Unfortunately, the agency wasn't hiring when I graduated, so I went to graduate school and got a PhD in political science with a focus on national security in hopes of making myself a more attractive candidate. Happily, it worked, and I started my dream job as a military analyst in what was then the Director of Intelligence at the agency in 1993. I'm going to walk briefly through some of the positions I had at the agency to give you a sense not only of my background, but of the variety of experiences available during an agency career. I arrived with a background in the Middle East, but spent my first 4 years following South Asian militaries. I learned the basics of being an analyst and an intelligence officer, and realized that even with a PhD, there was so much I never learned in school that I needed to succeed as an analyst. For my next job, I took a rotational assignment in the Directorate of Operations as a targeting officer, where I applied my analytic skills in support of DO counterproliferation operations around the world. After a few fascinating years, I moved into management as a first-line supervisor, first in the DO and then back in the DI, overseeing a team of analysts covering a key Middle Eastern country during 9/11 and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. After an intense few years in that position, I went on another rotation, this time to the National Intelligence Council, where I was one of 2 Deputy National Intelligence Officers for the Near East and South Asia. While there, I worked with the broader intelligence community and helped write 2 national intelligence estimates, which are large, forward-looking papers on key intelligence issues. A year later, I was back overseeing analysts, but this time as a second-line supervisor running a large group covering South Asia, then the Middle East, and finally, in a real change for me, East Asia. In the middle of that, I took a 1-year detour to run the DI's leadership and management training effort and created a course I ended up teaching for 8 years. Next, I moved to office-level management as Deputy Director of WINPAC, the Weapons Intelligence, Nonproliferation, and Arms Control Center. Its analysts covered weapons of mass destruction and weapons development programs around the world. It was a fascinating job that exposed me to the more technical side of the intelligence business. My final job was Deputy Director of the Office of Corporate Resources, where I served as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the Director of Analysis. In that position, I oversaw everything from HR and contracts to security and support functions. I was also in charge of personnel development and talent management for all analysts. It was a great way to develop a wide range of new skills. In addition to my normal duties, I spent a lot of time on what I guess I'd call extracurriculars, other tasks that supported the agency's overall mission. I ran several recruiting and hiring programs, was a member of the Executive Diversity and Inclusion Council, and ran the steering group that helped decide how to allocate the agency's analytic budget. I left the agency in 2015 to pursue new challenges, and since then I've been a principal at a Homeland Security consulting firm in D.C. and Director of Operations at a software company in the Middle East. For the past 3 years, I've been providing unique leadership, management, and professional skills training in the public and private sectors before becoming the Director of Proficiency 1 to bring these types of training experiences to a broader online audience. People often ask me if I had a typical career as an agency analyst, and that's a tricky question. It was only typical in that I had a series of fascinating and unpredictable jobs and duties that together made up a career, something that any of my peers could also claim. But the details of our careers are all different. I have friends who did several tours overseas or who did external rotations to the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, or working for Congress. There's no one career path for an analyst, which I think is great, and I'll come back to that later. So that's me. I have a broad and deep agency experience that I will bring to bear with personal stories as I move through this course. And I also remain closely connected to the agency today, so my information isn't dated. I'm confident that everything I'm telling you is still highly relevant. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you find this free Proficiency 1 course useful.